Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. The United States Senate voting 81 to 18, with one not voting, Senator Inhofe, who is not well, recovering from surgery. 81 to 18. This begins the process of reopening the part of the federal government not open right now, resolving the budget contest of these last weeks, and moving the story at least several months. Nothing is resolved, of course. It is Washington, D.C., and these are politicians, and we only pay attention when there's a dispute and when there's a pending vote. 81 to 18. The House of Representatives will vote later on this evening. The end of the world is avoided. We will live to fight another day. The president is being generous and careful in his response to the vote in the United States Senate. I'm told there was very little vote on the Senate floor. Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell worked out a deal that the House of Representatives has accepted. The expected vote in the House will be dominated by Democrats, the final yes vote. However, perhaps half or more of the Republicans will vote for the final deal. It continues the contest, continues the conversation for several more months to the new year. We kicked it into the new year. The can is clinking right now over New Year's and tumbling into the middle of January. However, there were a few remarks about the Affordable Care Act. I will have much to say about the Affordable Care Act later on this evening. I will also speak to a member of the House of Representatives, if all goes well and the House votes according to plan. Later on as well, Devin Nunes from California, who is in the leadership in the House. And we will explore what has happened in these last 24 hours, why this vote didn't happen yesterday. At the same time, the question of the Affordable Care Act, a separate and parallel discovery, is ongoing, and I will speak to that later on tonight as well. I welcome my colleague and friend Gordon Chang of Forbes.com, because while the United States is necessarily and a little vainly concentrating on its own food fights, disputes, finger-pointing of the moment, there is threat in the rest of the world from the rival for the 21st century domination. That's China. Gordon, a very good evening to you. China's economy is struggling, and Xi Jinping, the new boss, same as the old boss, is campaigning in a fashion that's reminiscent of what we'd have to say is Mao light. But the PLA, and especially the PLA Navy, is making provocative statements as well as making provocative moves in the East China Sea and the South China Sea. Do they regard that as their territory? Good evening, Gordon.
Good evening, John. Yes, now they look at the United States as being in terminal decline, and so the Chinese think basically they can do what they want, and they are pushing around their neighbors. You got to remember that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang, the leadership team in Beijing, had the field all to themselves at the APEC meeting in Indonesia and at the ASEAN meeting in Bali, in Brunei. And so essentially they think that this is their region to do what they want.
We welcome Toshi Yoshihara, professor at the Naval War College. Toshi, a very good evening to you. The statement from the second of the two meetings, the ASEAN meeting, is issued as a joint statement by the United States, Japan, and Australia. It quote, it opposes coercive or unilateral actions, and it especially looks at East China Sea and South China Sea. Opposing coercive and unilateral actions. That doesn't seem like doing very much. Is this a development in Asia that now people are speaking back against China? Good evening to you, Professor.
Good evening. This is clearly a strongly worded message directed at China. China really is the only power in the region that could potentially unilaterally, using coercive means, to change the status quo across maritime China. Now, this statement would seem like a fairly new development, but what is interesting is that both Japan and Australia, in conjunction with the United States, have issued similar statements for almost the past decade, talking about how the U.S. alliance system essentially care a great deal about freedom of navigation and would view any attempts at essentially harming the freedom of navigation as a source of grave concern. And so both the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S.-Australia alliance have separately, in various occasions, stated this concern. But what is interesting is that now it is being expressed in a trilateral format.
Gordon?
Toshi, it's also interesting that although Xi Jinping had the stage to himself in Bali, and of course Li Keqiang had the stage to himself in Brunei, they didn't really have a message that resonated, at least in terms of the South China Sea and the East China Sea claims. It seems that the countries there are still very wary of China and are very concerned about Chinese moves to extend their dominance in this region. So it would seem to me that although the United States wasn't there, and that certainly is a self-inflicted wound, nonetheless the Chinese were not able to exploit it fully because they don't have a message that other people like.
Right. I think by and large, many of the smaller neighbors in the region are still very wary and even very fearful of China, and that they remain unconvinced that China has really any sort of change of mind in terms of their position on these maritime disputes. In fact, over the years, what we have seen is that the Chinese have hardened their positions. They have insisted that this is something that they want to negotiate bilaterally, and that this is a sort of dispute that will have to go essentially China's way. And China is also challenging Japan in the East China Sea in a very similar way. And again, I don't think that this is going to change the tone and the atmosphere of the region, which is one of suspicion towards Beijing.
Toshi, is this a policy that is about internal disputes in China? Because it would be very difficult for them to enforce. I understand they have aspirations, but their navy is not first rate. Enforce the East China Sea and the South China Sea if they claim it as their own.
Well, I think their approach to the East and South China Sea dispute is a sort of salami slicing tactics, which is to make advances incrementally, creating realities on the ground in a particular locality, take a break, take a breath, and then advance someplace else when the opportunity arises. And what we see is a pattern of this opportunistic approach of sort of carving out pieces of the South China Sea, and then to see if there's no pushback that they would then push further. So there is an incremental, opportunistic approach to this that makes it very difficult to counter, both for the weaker players in the region, but also for the United States.
Gordon?
Toshi, the Japanese recently introduced a large vessel around the Senkaku Islands, which the Chinese and the Japanese both claim sovereignty over. How are the Chinese viewing Japan's introduction of a bigger ship into the disputed waters?
I think this is clearly a signal that the Japanese are concerned that they need to have larger warship, which means that it has greater endurance, that can stay at sea longer to deal with China's attempts at contesting Japan's administrative control over the waters around the Senkakus. What I'm really worried about is the fact that that's probably either too little too late, or that the longer-term trends suggest that Japan will not keep up. And the reality is China is building more ships and much faster than the Japanese, and the Japanese are just having a hard time keeping up. And so the Chinese are now basically able to continuously deploy patrol ships in the waters to contest Japan's control virtually on a continuous basis. And that's putting a lot of pressure on Japan. So I wonder whether this turn by the Japanese is really more of a sign of desperation than really an attempt at turning the heat on China.
Quickly, Yoshi, there was a statement from the Cold War, maybe it's proverbial. It was a Soviet general talking about the quality of tanks that were arrayed in Germany against the American tanks, NATO tanks. And he said sometimes quantity is quality. Is that true in the East China and South China Sea? Because they've got second and third rate assets out there, but can they overwhelm?
Well, I think that the picture is changing very quickly, where China is modernizing much more rapidly than we thought. But also, you're right, the Chinese can now deploy more ships and basically can outlast its neighbors. And I think that's where we'll begin to see a new normal emerge if China can sustain its presence and others can't.
Professor Toshi Yoshihara of the Naval War College. Right now, U.S., Japan, and Australia are speaking against the Chinese aggression. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com. This speech, by the way, would have been strengthened if it had been attended by the President of the United States. I'm John Batchelor.